The heat of July in Fort Wayne, Indiana, 1988 was thick and stifling, but the weather was not the only oppressive force descending upon the city. A darker, more chilling presence had arrived, stealthy and absolute. On a small residential street known for the sound of bicycles and the scent of freshly cut grass, April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old. She was a figure of pure, unbridled summer energy, a bright, petite presence who moved through her neighborhood with the fearless confidence of a child who believes her world is contained and safe. The summer was a kaleidoscope of simple joys, playing with her younger sister, riding her bicycle, and the casual freedom of visiting a neighbor just 3 doors down. This freedom, this unquestioned safety, would be the most critical vulnerability. On Friday, July 1st, April left her home in the early evening to walk the short, familiar distance. She wore a purple polka-dot shirt and was carrying a prized possession, her tiny, brightly colored purse. She walked away from the familiar porch light into the encroaching twilight. She never made it to the neighbor's house. The clock did not move quickly enough for the family. Within minutes, the absence was noted. Within the hour, panic was a cold certainty. The search began immediately, chaotic and desperate, focused on the few hundred feet of sidewalk between 2 homes. The first, immediate, terrifying clue was found just yards from her destination, April's abandoned bicycle. Lying on the lawn, the kickstand up, the chain intact. It was a still life of an interrupted childhood, signaling a sudden forced stop. This was not a child who strayed. This was a child who was taken. The profound violation began in that quiet, middle American neighborhood. The search that followed mobilized an entire city, turning every block, every bush, every shadow into a site of frantic, fruitless inspection. But the perpetrator was already gone, having executed a crime so swift, so clean, that it defied all initial investigation. The man who took April Tinsley did not simply hide her body, he hid himself perfectly. And then, he did something worse. He spent the next 3 decades ensuring that the agony of his crime would never be forgotten. He left notes, chilling, taunting letters, that transformed a brutal cold case into a psychological war waged against a community and its investigators. This is the story of a child's last, simple walk, and the cold-blooded monster who used ink and paper to prolong the nightmare for 30 years. This is a case defined by its horrifying details, the psychological warfare waged by the killer, and the scientific perseverance that finally broke the silence. If you value the time and effort it takes to meticulously research and tell these detailed stories accurately, please take a second now to hit the like button. It's the single best way to ensure this difficult story reaches the public attention it deserves. Now let's go back to Fort Wayne. The story of April Tinsley is not merely a timeline of a missing child and a discovery of a body. It is a unique narrative that forces us to grapple with the psychology of a killer who needed validation more than concealment. We follow the short, precious life of April, her bright, energetic presence that stood in such stark contrast to the darkness that consumed her. She was a beloved daughter and sister, a fixture in her tight-knit family, her absence ripping a hole through the fabric of their existence. The core of this narrative is the long wall of silence punctuated by the chilling, taunting notes. For 3 decades, this killer returned to the crime, inserting himself into the investigation, not with clues designed to help, but with messages designed to torture. These notes, left near the family home and in public places, became the investigator's most complex puzzle. A detailed yet veiled confession that provided the signature, but never the name. We will analyze the enormous investigative effort, the massive resources poured into handwriting analysis and criminal profiling across decades. We will track the numerous false leads and the pervasive fear that settled over Fort Wayne. A fear that lingered for years because the residents knew their predator was not only uncaptured, but actively watching. Finally, we explore the extraordinary turning point. The deployment of forensic genetic genealogy. This scientific revolution became the ultimate weapon against the anonymity the killer relied upon, utilizing fragments of DNA, evidence left behind long ago, to build a family tree and trace the lineage of a ghost. This promise is to deliver a complete, intricate account of a case that required patience, advanced science, and a fierce dedication to the victim, ensuring that the killer's reign of terror, measured not just in the crime but in the years of torment, finally met its legal conclusion. Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1988 was a picture of Midwestern confidence, a large, stable city that felt, in its residential areas, like an oversized small town. The neighborhood where April Tinsley lived was defined by its uniformity: small, well-maintained homes, generous lawns, and sidewalks that linked the lives of neighbors. This was a place where children were still afforded the classic, pre-digital freedom of playing outside unsupervised until dusk. April Tinsley was the essence of that time and place. 8 years old, she was known for her expressive eyes and an energy level that kept her constantly moving. She was the middle child in her blended family, a constant, cheerful presence. The family environment was one of deep connection and routine, centered on their home and the lives that unfolded on their quiet street. Her parents, John and Janet, provided a home environment rooted in structure and affection. April's relationship with her sisters was typical, a mix of games, rivalry, and deep loyalty. She was a familiar fixture on her bicycle, traveling the short, comfortable distance to her grandmother's house or a neighbor's. The concept of danger on these familiar paths was simply not a reality. The evening of Friday, July the 1st, 1988, began like any other Friday at the start of summer vacation. The air was heavy with heat, and the freedom of the weekend lay ahead. April had permission for a short, quick visit to a friend 3 houses down the street. It was an itinerary that required maybe 90 seconds of walking. The time frame was too small, the distance too trivial, for any parental concern to materialize. She was dressed for play, carrying her small purse, a detail that emphasizes the innocent nature of her outing. The family's perception of safety was absolute, rooted in the familiar faces and closed environment of their street. This belief in the neighborhood's security, the common human tendency to underestimate the possibility of evil in one's own backyard, was the vulnerability the predator exploited. When the friend's mother called asking if April had left yet, the first cold wave of dread struck the Tinsley home. The alarm was not a casual concern. It was an immediate, visceral certainty that something had gone fundamentally wrong. April was too reliable, too close to home for a simple delay. The quick, frantic search by the family immediately confirmed the worst. The discovery of her small bicycle, lying abandoned with the kickstand up, was the signature of a life brutally and instantly paused. It was a sign of a struggle, or at least a rapid, forced stop. The bike, meant for movement and freedom, became a stationary, silent witness to a crime that would forever shatter the small-town illusion of Fort Wayne. The interruption was total, turning a familiar street into a horrifying crime scene and plunging a family into an abyss of incomprehensible fear. The disappearance was instantly recognized as critical. The local Fort Wayne Police Department was mobilized, transforming the quiet residential area into a nexus of frantic activity. The focus was zeroed in on that short, 100-foot strip of sidewalk. The first agonizing night was spent searching every basement, every overgrown yard, every vehicle. The initial hope, that April was being held nearby, quickly dissolved into the cold reality of abduction. The investigative assumption was that the killer lived or worked nearby, was familiar with the neighborhood routine, and had been patiently waiting for a vulnerable moment. 3 days later, on Monday, July 4th, the unbearable uncertainty ended. A man walking in a shallow drainage ditch in a field off of US 33 near the village of Spencerville, about 20 miles north of Fort Wayne, made the grim discovery. April Tinsley's body was found, dumped in the undergrowth. She had been sexually assaulted and smothered. The scene was devastatingly important. The perpetrator had traveled a short but deliberate distance, choosing a remote, semi-rural location to conceal the body. This geographical movement provided the first subtle clue. The killer had local knowledge of the secluded disposal site, suggesting again an intimate familiarity with the area outside the immediate city. The immediate investigation focused on 2 critical areas: the abduction site and the recovery site. At the recovery site, forensic technicians found crucial, though minute, physical evidence, a few hairs, fibers, and most critically, biological evidence left by the killer. This DNA evidence, microscopic as it was, became the single greatest hope for solving the case, if only technology could catch up to the crime. The medical examination confirmed the cause of death, smothering, indicating a quick, brutal end to the abduction. The emotional response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. A pervasive sense of terror gripped Fort Wayne. Parents pulled their children inside. The freedom of summer was abruptly canceled, replaced by a deep communal fear that a monster was living among them, hidden by the very normalcy of the town. The police launched a massive, coordinated effort. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Every known sex offender in the Tri-County area was placed under surveillance and questioned. Local fishermen, contractors, and anyone who drove a pickup truck, the primary vehicle of interest in rural northern Indiana, were vetted. But the initial sweep was fruitless. The killer was too careful, too practiced, or simply too lucky. The small forensic evidence they had, the seminal fluid containing the killer's DNA, was a beacon of hope in the late 1980s. But DNA technology was still in its infancy. It could identify a person if they were already in a database, but it could not yet perform the kind of familial testing that would become possible decades later. The DNA was logged, preserved, and stored, a silent physical key to the case that the investigators could only wait to unlock. The physical investigation hit a hard wall. The initial leads dried up. The vastness of the rural Indiana landscape proved to be the killer's perfect ally. He had executed the crime and the disposal with enough precision and geographical knowledge to evade immediate capture. The case began its long, cold journey into the files of unsolved homicides, defined by the memory of a missing 8-year-old and the microscopic evidence waiting patiently for the future to arrive. The true magnitude of the case, however, had not yet been revealed. The killer was not satisfied with the silencing. He needed to be heard. The murder of April Tinsley became a case study in psychological terrorism, defined not just by the crime itself, but by the relentless, cruel engagement of the killer years after the fact. For 30 years, the killer used the United States Postal Service and public fear to sustain his connection to the tragedy. The initial years were dominated by the agonizing wait for a breakthrough. The police team, though dedicated, was locked in the limitations of the era's technology. The fear in Fort Wayne was palpable, but without a suspect or a viable lead, the case began to fade from the front pages, sinking into the cold storage of unresolved violence. Then, 3 years after the murder, the silence was shattered. In 1990, a chilling note was found pinned to a barn wall in Spencerville, near where April's body had been recovered. The note was handwritten, crude, and explicit. It contained details about the crime that only the perpetrator would know, confirming its authenticity. The text was boastful, gloating, and deeply disturbing, revealing a killer who not only enjoyed the power of the crime, but also the power of the secret. This single note instantly transformed the investigation. It was no longer a puzzle of physics and geography, but a psychological duel. The killer was actively participating, taunting the investigators and the Tinsley family. The police immediately recognized the critical importance of the handwriting. It was the only new physical evidence they had. A specialized task force was established, poring over the handwriting and attempting to build a detailed profile. The penmanship was analyzed for slant, pressure, grammar, and style, seeking any commonality that could be linked to school records, employment applications, or public forms. The analysis suggested the writer was a white male, likely in his 20s or 30s at the time of the crime, with a high school education, attempting to disguise his natural hand. The taunts continued, sporadically, over the next 2 decades, keeping the emotional wound raw. In 1991, a similar explicit note was found near the family's home, left for the parents to find. The content was designed to inflict maximum emotional pain, proving the killer was actively monitoring the family and the case's lack of progress. The investigators recognized this pattern. The killer needed to feel powerful, needing the affirmation that he had paralyzed a community and evaded the state's most dedicated resources. By 2004, the terror escalated. A note was found on the windshield of a car near the Tinsley home. This note was accompanied by a photograph of a young girl. The killer was now actively involving new potential victims, a shocking escalation designed to demonstrate his continued freedom and proximity. The public was alerted, leading to a renewed wave of fear and vigilance. Each note, meticulously examined by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, reinforced the same profile: a disorganized but locally entrenched offender, obsessed with the case, who needed to periodically re-engage with his crime to satisfy a deep psychological compulsion. They knew the handwriting was the key, but without a suspect to compare it to, it remained an agonizing cipher. The notes themselves, written on various types of paper, and sometimes delivered in cheap supermarket envelopes, became their own forensic subjects. They yielded latent prints, which were also preserved, but again, without a match in the databases of the time. They were dead ends. The killer, through his taunts, had successfully transformed the entire investigation into a high-stakes psychological drama, mocking law enforcement for 30 years while remaining an invisible threat in the heart of the community. The Tinsley family bore the brunt of this sustained psychological assault. Every note found, every news report, was a fresh tidal wave of grief and fear. Their resilience became the moral center of the cold case, their persistent refusal to let the case die serving as a silent counter-taunt to the killer's arrogance. Investigators maintained a deep, professional commitment, knowing that they had the DNA and the handwriting, and they simply needed the science or the slip-up that would connect the two. For nearly 30 years, the case remained in this deadlock: pristine, cold DNA on file, and a unique, verified handwriting sample. The police had the what, the crime, and the who, the genetic profile, but they lacked the name. This agonizing wall was finally breached not by a confession, but by a scientific revolution known as forensic genetic genealogy. The year was 2018. FGG had achieved national prominence by solving the Golden State Killer case, proving the power of using consumer DNA databases, like GED Match, to identify relatives of a perpetrator. The Fort Wayne Task Force, having exhausted every traditional lead and every local DNA comparison, recognized FGG as their only remaining path to justice. The process was intricate and demanding, requiring meticulous preparation and delicate handling of the 30-year-old evidence. The stored DNA sample from the 1988 crime scene was carefully processed and uploaded to the public genealogy database, transforming the anonymous genetic profile into a pattern of shared markers. The goal was not to find the killer directly, but to find distant cousins, third, fourth, or fifth relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA. The FGG process then began its painstaking work. The DNA profile yielded matches to several distant relatives. Using these shared markers, a team of genealogists, working in tandem with investigators, began the process of building massive, complex family trees spanning hundreds of years and thousands of individuals. They meticulously traced the common ancestors, shared by the DNA match and the killer, slowly narrowing the scope of the investigation to a smaller, more recent branch of the family tree. This required analyzing birth records, death certificates, census data, and obituaries, connecting disparate public records to a single genetic lineage. The genealogists worked relentlessly, sometimes focusing on only a few names per week, until they had narrowed the killer's potential identity down to a cluster of male cousins. The profile built from the taunting notes and the physical evidence was overlaid onto this genetic shortlist. The investigative focus eventually fixed on a man named John D. Miller, a name that had never surfaced in the original 1988 investigation. Miller was local to the area. He was a retired truck driver, living quietly in the community of Grabille, Indiana, a short distance from Fort Wayne. His age and geographical history perfectly matched the cold case profile, a man entrenched in the region who had been watching and waiting. The identification was a genetic probability, not a legal certainty. To confirm the match, investigators needed a fresh, verifiable DNA sample from Miller. The operation shifted into a high-stakes, covert surveillance mission. Miller was watched continuously, his movements tracked for days by a dedicated team. The investigators needed a discarded item, a single piece of trash containing his DNA. The final crucial piece of evidence was collected when Miller discarded a used water bottle and a paper plate into his trash. The items were retrieved under cover of darkness, handled with the utmost care, and immediately rushed to the forensic lab. The feeling within the task force during this period was a combination of intense anticipation and paralyzing fear. 30 years of work rested on the quality of a discarded water bottle. The lab results were awaited with bated breath. The moment the match was confirmed was the true turning point. The DNA from the water bottle was a definitive match to the DNA found on April Tinsley's body in 1988. The anonymity was finally shattered. The man who had taunted a city for 30 years had been silenced by his own genetic code. The confirmed DNA match was the final, unassailable piece of evidence needed for an arrest. The decades-long investigation, marked by frustration, torment, and silence, now moved with surgical speed. On July 15, 2018, 30 years and 2 weeks after the crime, John D. Miller, a 59-year-old retired truck driver, was arrested at his home in Grable, Indiana. The sight of the police descending on his quiet, ordinary residence marked the definitive end of his decades-long life in the shadows. During the subsequent questioning, confronted with the overwhelming scientific evidence of his DNA match, Miller began to offer statements that confirmed his involvement. The police also executed search warrants, recovering items that, when compared to the original cold case files, provided powerful corroboration. Crucially, the recovered materials included handwriting samples. When compared to the original taunting notes left over the past 3 decades, the notes found on the barn, near the Tinsley home, and on the windshield, the evidence was conclusive. The man who murdered April Tinsley and the man who taunted her family for 30 years were the same person. The handwriting, the DNA, and the confession of involvement provided a convergence of evidence that was unbreakable. The Tinsley family, who had fought for so long, received the news with a wave of mixed, overwhelming emotions. A crushing sorrow for the loss, but an immense, profound relief that the shadow over their lives had finally been removed. The weight of the 3 decades of silence and taunts was lifted in a single moment of legal certainty. The court process moved quickly toward its conclusion. Recognizing the strength of the DNA and handwriting evidence, John D. Miller eventually pleaded guilty to the murder and criminal confinement of April Tinsley. The decision spared the family the prolonged agony of a trial, providing a definitive legal closure to the case. The sentencing hearing was the final formal act of justice. It was an opportunity for the family, represented by April's older sister, to confront the man who had stolen their peace and their child. The court formally sentenced Miller to 80 years in prison, a sentence that ensured he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The resolution of the April Tinsley case became a landmark moment for law enforcement across the country. It was a powerful demonstration of the potential of forensic genetic genealogy to solve the most difficult, most stubborn cold cases. It confirmed that the meticulous preservation of evidence, even decades old, combined with cutting-edge science and unwavering police persistence, could ultimately defeat a killer's belief in his own invincibility. April Tinsley's life spanned a precious 8 years, but her memory became a fierce, unyielding mandate for justice that stretched for 3 decades. The legacy of this case is twofold. First, it is a testament to the heroic, agonizing resilience of the Tinsley family, who were terrorized not just by a crime, but by the relentless, cruel correspondence of the killer. Their refusal to let the case be forgotten kept the file active and the pressure immense. Second, the case stands as a monument to the power of forensic science. The DNA sample, found on a summer night in 1988, was a ghost of a clue, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Its ultimate identification through genetic genealogy confirms that no matter how long the passage of time, science is continually closing the gap on anonymity. The perpetrator of the crime, John D. Miller, believed that by surviving for 30 years and by hiding behind the shield of crude, taunting notes, he had won. But time was his enemy. His final, discarded piece of litter, a water bottle, became the undoing of his long, wicked secret. The fear that gripped Fort Wayne for so long is gone. April Tinsley is remembered not for the horror of her final hours, but for the resilience of the family who fought a 30-year war in her name. If you have any information regarding an unresolved cold case, particularly one with biological evidence, please contact your local FBI office or police department. The science is now on your side. This complex tapestry of crime and scientific breakthrough is a defining narrative of the cold case files. If you want to understand the dark truth behind another incredible story, where decades of work and a single piece of evidence finally brought a killer to justice, watch our next cinematic exploration.